Hello, everyone, and welcome again to Devex at UNGA 76. My name is Michael Igoe. I'm a senior reporter at Devex, and I'm so excited for this session. We're talking about climate change, energy, health, climate impacts, where it fits into the UNGA agenda, and beyond, perhaps even more importantly. I'm joined by two really phenomenal people, experts in this space, who bring a wealth of different experiences. Rachel Kyte is the Dean of the Fletcher School at Tufts University. She's the former special representative of the UN Secretary General and CEO of Sustainable Energy for All, former World Bank Group Vice President and Special Envoy for Climate Change, and she's deeply involved in advising around COP26, including with the UK government. So really, checking a lot of boxes there. Harjeet Singh, a global expert on the issues of climate impacts, mitigation, and adaptation. He's been supporting countries across the world on tackling climate change. One of the people who really brings the experience of climate change impacts to the negotiations every year at the international climate change summits, and somebody that I really turn to and rely on for that perspective. He's a senior advisor at Climate Action Network International, and provides strategic advice on global partnerships to the Fossil Fuel Non-Proliferation Treaty Initiative, as well as a wealth of other experiences. Thank you both so much for joining. I'm really excited for this discussion. And one other thing I should mention is that as I've covered the climate change conferences in past years, a productive day for me is one spent sort of shuttling back and forth between the two of you, gathering your perspectives and trying to relate that to our readers. So thank you for all that you've done to help me understand these issues. And I'm not sure how well you know each other, but you have at least a sort of common link in my reporting. So thanks for that. We're going to have a conversation here, and I hope this can be sort of informal. But let's start with where we are today, which is UNGA, and the agenda that we're seeing and how climate change sort of fits into it. And Rachel, let me start with you. I mean, a couple of years ago, the Secretary General sort of basically made all of UNGA about climate change. This year, climate change is sort of competing for attention with other crises. Obviously, COVID is front of mind, but now also the crisis in Afghanistan. It's a packed agenda and a pretty daunting one. What are you watching for during this General Assembly for indication that world leaders and the major development institutions are committed to ensuring climate remains somewhere near the top of the agenda? What should we be watching?
So great to be here, Michael, and it's great to be in Harjeet's company. So first of all, it is going to be a disrupted General Assembly. I think the new and incoming President of the General Assembly, Abdullah Shahid, I think is hoping that foreign ministers and heads of state come, but the host country has sort of tried to dissuade people not to. And so I think the one in-person meeting that the Secretary General is going to be doing will be the small climate sort of head of state, foreign ministers meeting. But so it is top priority for him. He's laid out a common agenda to try to sort of delineate where solidarity can be refound almost amongst nations. But for most developing countries, they're coming to this General Assembly with no global compact on vaccines, no real demonstrable sense that that solidarity can take place in reality rather than in words, and that follows through then into climate. Um, so I don't think you can take the climate discussion outside of the conversations around security, around the role of the UN, and around vaccines and sort of that kind of solidarity. When it comes to climate, however, the presidency of COP26 has sort of, glibly said this is about coal, cash, cars, and trees. Well, coal and cash are on the agenda at the General Assembly. All eyes will be on China 1 year after the blockbuster announcement of a 2060 net zero target. Can the Chinese come forward at the General Assembly, or will they choose the General Assembly as a place where they can put some further delineation around peaking coal, funding coal overseas, or stopping funding coal overseas? So, can there be some progress there? the Secretary General has already called multiple times for an ending of subsidies, for people to come with greater ambition. Can any of that happen at the General Assembly for those countries that haven't yet filed with the UN? That would be good. And then cash. And here all eyes really are on the United States, which in a great piece of work done by the Overseas Development Institution based out of London last week, showing how far behind the US is in its commitment on finance. And while there's, I think, some interesting new initiatives coming to mobilize finance from the private sector and finance from philanthropy and elsewhere, at the end of the day, the US's commitment in public finance that would help meet the 100 billion. I think there are people hoping that some announcement on that might be coming at the General Assembly. If not, that it would come soon thereafter at the meetings of the bank and the fund. So, running out of time for COP26, so this platform would be important in terms of seeing some progress.
And before I pull you in, Harjeet, Rachel, let me follow up with you quickly. I mean, one notable aspect of this UNGA is that it's President Joe Biden's first. Are you going to be watching his speech for specifics on climate finance? Is that something that, is that a place where that typically happens?
Yeah, at some point the US has to come and tell everybody what it's what it's going to be pledging and how it's going to be moving forward. That would be a place to do it if they're ready. If not, then it's going to be in the margins of the bank and the fund's annual meetings. And this is where President Biden says again that they're back on issues of climate. Unfortunately, um, recent events in Afghanistan have showed that there is a qualification to the extent to which the US is back. And I think that the ripple effect of that will be quite pronounced. Finally, I think the Secretary General has been very pointed in his call upon the MDBs and the Bretton Woods institutions to do more than they are. And obviously, there are conversations about even more capital flowing to the MDBs for more targeted action. And I think that you'll still continue to see the United Nations sort of indicating to its sister institutions what it wants them to do.
Excellent. I want to dig into that MDB piece and the sort of the questions about where development institutions stand on this. But sticking with the big picture for a moment, Harjeet, I think this year has been one of kind of climate disaster in every part of the world, and I don't know the extent to which it's true that that is sort of driving more political will. You probably have a better sense of that than I do. But how do you see the sort of growing awareness of climate change impacts playing into COP26 or even UNGA before that? And what are the key issues related to climate change impacts that negotiators are focused on?
Thank you, Michael, for inviting me, and it's a pleasure to join you and Rachel in this conversation. Well, it's true. We have seen disasters all over the world, and climate crisis has reminded us that no country, poor or rich, can escape climate impacts. But the reality also is that developing countries who are least responsible for the crisis are the ones struggling the most to cope with the impacts and recover from the increasing frequency and intensity of these disasters. Now, as we have seen developed countries who did feel that they are much more secured and their focus all these years have been on reducing emissions and talking about technology and finance, realize that even they are not prepared. Now, that very realization should be a reason for more sympathy and empathy as well as solidarity towards the global south. We have not seen that resulting into real support, as Rachel just mentioned. Even the United States, that should be coming up with a much more generous offer of providing finance and supporting developing countries to be prepared to deal with disasters, that has not happened yet. So it has not been meeting its fair share of responsibility. And we hope the kind of crisis we have seen now, COVID and climate intertwining each other as well, because the same countries are far more vulnerable to both the crisis. We have not yet seen concrete support coming in. Now with UNGA and then with the COP coming up, we hope that leaders step up and make sure that there is real money that is provided to developing countries so that they can protect their citizens and make sure they are prepared for future disasters. So there's a lot that needs to happen, and providing support for adaptation or dealing with loss and damage has achieved least progress over the last few years. And the money that has been counted as climate finance, we've also seen reports coming out saying it's not a real money because it's largely loans and guarantees instead of providing public finance, which is absolutely needed to prepare for these disasters. So there's a lot that still needs to happen between now and the COP to make sure that countries who are most vulnerable get support.
Probably a good time to address the elephant in the room, which is that CAN International, the global network that you're sort of representing, Harjeet, last week, I think it was, or 2 weeks ago, I suppose, um, released a statement calling for COP26 to be postponed for these exact reasons. And I think an important thing for people to understand is that something that has really struck me in covering the climate change conferences is that they've really existed on this very kind of narrow knife edge of cooperation for years between higher and lower income countries, and this sort of agreement that there would be support for lower income countries to deal with climate change impacts, and in a lot of cases, a lot of commitments that haven't been fulfilled. So, I mean, Harjeet, CAN released its statement. It sounds like the UK government is going to forge ahead, sort of regardless of what happens. But maybe setting that specific question aside for a second, I mean, what needs to happen in order to honestly keep these climate negotiations afloat?
Well, Michael, the negotiations at COP26 are going to happen in the backdrop of vaccine inequity. And when we talk about climate justice, we are talking about that inequality that exists between poor and rich countries, between elite and poor communities. And if we think that climate change is a standalone crisis, we are fooling the world and we are ignoring the elephant in the room, which is the interconnected elements that have caused the problem in the first place, whether we talk about vaccine inequity or the climate crisis. It is that inequality. It is about some people, some countries, some organizations, corporations who are causing the crisis and then leaving the rest of the world to struggle with it. And for the UK government to only making efforts to keep the show on the road and ignoring the big picture and the fundamental of how to deal with a global crisis is not a good signal, is not a sign of real solidarity. And if we really want COP26 to succeed, we need to, one, make sure that the logistical issues are sorted. We have seen how least developed countries coming out after Climate Action Network released its statement saying we don't feel confident that we will be in the room. We still do not have enough clarity. We have not received enough support. So for UK government and the UN system, they have to come up with a very clear plan to ensure that it is going to be a safe and equitable and just COP, which means that poor countries and their delegates and civil society are in the room because we are talking about a climate crisis that affects them the most, which means their voices are much more needed in the room. And the current level of clarity doesn't give enough confidence, particularly to least developed countries, to even decide on their plans. The cost of quarantine after Cannes statement, UK government did come up with an announcement that they're going to cover the quarantine cost in the UK. But what about the cost that is rising because they have not booked their tickets yet? What about the quarantine cost in other countries, in transit countries? That's not clear. And least developed countries clearly said that in many cases, they are going to be out for several weeks before and after the COP. So, and it's not just about delegates; it's also about assuring their families. And we have not yet heard a detailed plan to make it a safe, equitable, and just COP. So, logistics has not been sorted, And if we do not have right kind of representation, how we are going to make sure that the outcome is also fair and just? Because some of the key issues that are going to be discussed are about dealing with climate impacts. It's about adaptation, finance, loss and damage, or even rules for the market. And if you do not have all countries in the room and with the kind of technical expertise they need, I don't think we can call the outcome as a legitimate outcome. So there are many big question marks still we have, which will give confidence to least developed countries in particular.
Rachel, what's your view here? I take it you have some sort of reservations about this strategy of just keeping the talks alive, come what may. But what's the, stepping back a bit, I mean, what needs to happen to keep some degree of space for cooperation open between wealthier and lower income countries and delegates here?
Well, I think Selwyn Hart, who runs the Secretary General's climate team in New York, has underlined last week that for the UN, the principle which they insist upon for negotiations is that everybody's equal, right? Within the United Nations, every country is equal, and so it is to the presidency to make sure that that can be realised in the way in which the negotiations are held. And obviously, we saw in the intersessionals it's very difficult. I mean, you see developing country regional groupings getting together so that they can help themselves, work within a hybrid format, etc. But it's hard. And if you look at what the agenda is, then we've got to make critical progress on adaptation. We've got to make loss and damages on the agenda, issues of markets, as Harjeet has said. It's impossible to have those negotiations with 2/3 of the world not there. And so, I think that the presidency is caught a little bit. There's lots of excitement about the race to zero and sort of lots of commitments that are being made. And we saw a lot of that around Paris and other COPs. But this is the COP which is really about ratcheting up ambition in a meaningful way, holding ourselves to account for that ambition, really making progress on adaptation because look at the impacts that are all around us, and really making substantial progress on finance, which has many different elements to it. I mean, and then other things. And so um, it's welcome that the presidency has been forced to sort of, I think, pay for quarantining. I don't think it goes far enough at this point. With just 50 days to go, I'm not sure what more could be done. And I think what was regrettable last week was this sort of little sense of sort of a little frisson when we saw some developing country delegates arguing with some developing country civil society. None of us can take any pleasure in that. The point is that if the COPs are meaningful, that everybody's there and we thrash these things out together. And if the COP has been organised in such a way that that is not possible, then there has to be supplemental, arrangements. So we already know we're going to have to come back quicker than 5 years with new ambition because things are moving so fast. So it'll be interesting to say, but with 50 days to go, it's on the presidency to make this work. And I think there's great nervousness amongst many countries that they're going to have a really hard time operating in Glasgow with just one body there and civil society on the telephone and lawyers scattered all around the world. I mean, we'll have to make the best of a bad job.
So climate change adaptation, Rachel, you described as a key piece here, a key area where we need to see progress. What does progress on climate change adaptation mean? I think that's probably, along with maybe sort of loss and damage and some issues around energy. For our Devex readers, there's a big overlap there in the Venn diagram between climate change adaptation and development. So, what does the development community that's focused on climate change need to understand about sort of where the conversation currently sits on adaptation? What might get decided? What would progress look like? And that's for both of you. I know you both work deeply on this issue.
Well, maybe I'll just take one element of it, and Harjeet has got much more to say with different perspective and more wisdom, probably. Just on the financial part of adaptation, it's getting boiled down into 50% of all finance should be for adaptation. I think that first of all, we do need to see much more funding pledged into countries' efforts to build resilience and into community efforts to build their own resilience and adaptation. But 50% of what is always a big question, right? So 50% of not enough is not enough. But here I think it becomes very important that the sort of MDBs, the places to which countries go for sustained support over periods of time, where this is where we need to see a sort of, I would say, a quantum leap or a step change in the way that we think about adaptation. So it's not just about the numerical target, it is about making sure that all education lending, all health lending, all agricultural lending has this new reality built in, and that while the additional costs of a project because of it needs to be able to adapt to a different environment are met, that really the way we think about support to health services, so that health services are going to be electrified and that electrification is going to be clean and renewable and affordable and reliable. These are the shift in thinking that we need to see, and there are elements of that coming into focus, but I think the urgency is still lacking.
So Rachel has picked up the most important issue right now, which is that money for adaptation support to developing countries is not enough, and we can keep talking about making it 50%, but we are talking about just 20 or 30% of money currently going for adaptation. So one, the balance is not there, and second, it's not enough. And the numbers that came from UNEP report in 2016 saying that we would be needing $280 billion by 2030 every year to $500 billion a year by 2050, the way impacts are rising. And that report goes back to 2016, and we have seen far more damaging impacts in the last few years, which means these numbers are going to go upwards. And we are nowhere near. The talk about $100 billion itself shows that we are not meeting that commitment. And rich countries are putting some kind of a dodgy methodology and some cooked up numbers. And it's not a real support that's going to poor and vulnerable countries. So, finance happens to be the most important issue. And some of the other elements, like at this COP26, we are going to see discussion on global goal on adaptation. For mitigation, it's far more simpler. We talk about a temperature goal, or we talk about gigaton of emissions. But in case of adaptation, where we are referring to how we can keep the people safe, so it's very hard to put a finger on one metrics and say, yes, we can come up with that number and define adaptation or a global goal. So that discussion is happening. But the discussion should not get embroiled in those technicalities. The world should agree that we have to keep the people and planet safe. And as emissions continue to rise, which means impacts are also going to rise, and we are already witnessing that, we need to invest more in adaptation to protect the development gains and make sure that people who are going to face increasing number of disasters with much more intensity, how they are prepared to deal with that. And also, in some situation where adaptation is not going to be enough and they're going to face loss and damage, there has to be a system that helps them in terms of humanitarian relief and recovery and even rehabilitation. So the whole spectrum of dealing with climate impacts, on preparing before the disaster, and then in cases where the impacts are inevitable or unavoidable, they also need to be supported. The discussion on that is still very difficult and contentious because everything boils down to money. And discussion on money, as we all know, has not been easy because rich countries are not opening their purses yet. And we still see, in fact, the development aid being either diverted or branded as adaptation finance. It's not going to be enough if we really want to protect the development gains we have made over the last few years.
A lot of this comes down to a negotiation between kind of the big influential development institutions and the political leaders who sort of hold their purse strings or make their policy preferences loud and clear to those institutions. But from both of you, what sort of room for improvement do you see in the influential development institutions? I'm thinking, the World Bank and IMF with their annual meetings coming up shortly after UNGA. Other MDBs, some of the bilateral donors are now, and I think USAID is in the process of coming up with a new climate change strategy under the Biden administration. What does leadership look like for a development institution that wants to take climate change seriously at this point?
Well, I think for the banks, it's using their capital and their balance sheets um, to the utmost efficiency, and that probably means taking slightly more risk. It means there's room to change some of the internal rules that were put there for good reason when the bank's mission was slightly different. I mean, there still needed to be countercyclical funders, etc. But we're in an age of the need to rapidly decarbonize, and so um, you know for example, in IFC, is 20 a cap on 25% of equity. The most effective way for them to be, you know, really aggressive in the move for um, clean electrification in certain countries. I don't know. I think that sort of everything should be on the table, basically. And certainly, as more capital gets deployed to the MDBs, because they may be the most effective way to house and then push this out, both in budget support to countries, but also then to leverage um, more money in. I think that's very important. I mean, secondly, is that countries need to be able to access the big chunks of money, and so some of the issues around which have been raised by the Economic Commission on Africa very effectively, how countries can access the capital markets, issues of terms of trade. These are all going to be terribly important. There's room for many developing countries to invest their own resources more effectively in their own private sectors as well. Um, but I think that everything should be on the table in terms. So it's not just about um, you know bolstering IDA and giving it another adaptation window, etc. It's about you know we are now here in 2021. We've got 9 years to cut emissions by half. We have got extraordinary needs for investment in resilient infrastructure and to make social services and safety nets resilient for the kinds of potential losses of success that we've seen in the last 20 to 30 years. Are we fit for purpose? And that's the question. And that I think extends to every aspect of how these banks access the capital markets, manage their balance sheets, manage their treasury operations, and manage their lending. So this is a time to be bold, and that requires the shareholders and the owners of these banks to allow them to take a little bit more risk, I think, and then couple that with some of the innovation that we're starting to see in global philanthropy, a huge uptick in financial resources available, but are they available to everybody? And then a huge uptick potentially in the understanding from private capital that we're really running out of time. So all to play for.
Harjeet, last word to you.
Well, agreeing to everything that Rachel said, it has to be holistic, it has to be comprehensive. And let us also remove discrepancies, because we have seen some of these banks on their one arm is talking about climate compatible development and green development, while the other arm continues to fund fossil fuel. I think those discrepancies need to be removed. It took them such a long time to articulate their vision, and now that vision of green development has to be implemented. And we need to also remember that countries like Nigeria or Angola, whose economy still depends on fossil fuel extraction, you can't just ask them to stop to turn the tap off. They need to be supported. And that's where the concept of just transition is very important. Like Rachel said, it's about trade, it's about, supporting their economy, it's about investments, it's about changing markets. So, how do you support a country like Nigeria or Angola or Uganda to reduce its dependence on fossil fuel and transition their economies in a just manner? Because that's when you have to think about not only economy but jobs and people and planet. That requires a much bigger thinking and a support package for those countries to make that transition. And on top of it, they are the ones facing climate impacts. So these banks and multilateral institutions have to take everything into account and talk about a climate compatible development, which is green, resilient, and puts people at the center.
Fantastic. Well, you've set up an ambitious agenda. We'll have to wait and see how much progress we get, both at UNGA, at the annual meetings, and then at COP26. I hope we can stay in touch, and I'll look forward to getting your feedback and your reviews when the time comes. Rachel, Harjeet, thank you so much for joining us today. It's been my pleasure.
Thank you.
Likewise. Thank you so much.